All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we're tackling something that I think a lot of people, especially couples, find pretty intimidating. We're going to be talking about bankruptcy.
Yeah, bankruptcy. I think just the word itself can make people feel, well, a little uneasy.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not exactly light dinner conversation, but it's something that a lot of folks unfortunately have to deal with at some point in their lives. And when you add in the complexities of marriage joint finances, shared assets, it can get really complicated really fast.
It definitely adds a whole other layer, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So to help us unpack all of this, we're going to be looking at a chapter from Peter Francis Geraci's book, The Complete Book on Bankruptcy.
Ah, a classic.
It really is. And this particular chapter is called, If I Am Married, Can I File a Bankruptcy Without My Husband or Wife? It's from chapter 10. And I think it's a question a lot of couples have, right? Like, what are my options if things go south financially? Can we file together? Do we have to? What if only one of us wants to file?
Yeah, those are all really important questions. And I think what's great about this chapter is that it uses real-life examples to break down the different scenarios and give some practical answers.
Exactly. And, Geraci Law, Peter Francis Geraci's firm, they've been helping people navigate this for over 40 years, so they really know their stuff.
They really do. They have so much experience helping people get through what can be a really tough time.
Okay, so the chapter starts by making it clear that there's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to bankruptcy for married couples. It's not as simple as just checking a box.
Right. It's all very situational.
You've got options. You can file jointly, you can file separately, or just one spouse can file. But how do you know which path is the right one?
Well, that's where it gets interesting, and that's where a lot of those questions you were just talking about come into play.
It does. The best choice, it really depends on your income, your assets, the types of debt you're dealing with, and even where you live.
Oh, absolutely. State laws can make a huge difference, too.
So let's dive into some of those real-life examples because I think that's where it really starts to click.
Yeah, I love those. They bring it to life.
They do. The first one they call the high-income household. And just imagine this. One spouse loses their job and is drowning in credit card debt, while the other spouse is bringing in a solid income, say $130,000.
Okay, yeah, that's a pretty common scenario, unfortunately.
It is. Now, they have a joint checking account, and they're both on the title to a couple of properties, but only one spouse is actually on the mortgage. So the big question is, can the spouse with the mountain of credit card debt just file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy and wipe it all away?
It seems like it would make sense, right? Especially since the debt is technically just in their name.
Yeah, you'd think so.
Yeah.
But Chapter 7 has those pesky income limits, and in this case, their combined household income, including that high-earning spouse, is too high to qualify. It's not just about the individual debt, it's about the household's overall financial picture.
So it's not as simple as just looking at who owes what.
Nope. And to make things even more complicated, they're both on the title to those properties.
Right, which means those assets could be at risk too. A trustee, the person overseeing the bankruptcy, might object to wiping out the debt because of those properties.
So Chapter 7 might be off the table. What are their options then?
Well, this might be a situation where Chapter 13 makes more sense.
Can you remind us how Chapter 13 works?
Sure. It's basically a reorganization plan. You work out a payment plan to pay back a portion of your debts over a period of time, usually 3 to 5 years.
Okay, so in this scenario, they'd set up a payment plan and potentially be able to keep those properties while getting a handle on their debt.
Exactly. It's all about finding the right strategy for the specific situation.
And this just goes to show you, it's really not as straightforward as people think. You have to look at the whole picture, not just the individual debts.
Absolutely. Now, let's look at that second example. It's called the newlywed with debt from a previous marriage. This one's pretty different.
Okay, tell me more. I'm intrigued.
So we've got a newly married couple, and one spouse comes into the marriage with a bunch of debt from a previous relationship. They've kept their finances completely separate. No joint accounts, no shared property, nothing.
Oh, wow. So they're really drawing a line in the sand financially.
Exactly. Now, the spouse with the debt makes $25,000 a year, while their new spouse makes, again, that $130,000. So the question is, can the spouse with the debt file for Chapter 7 on their own in this case?
I'm guessing it's a different outcome than the first example.
You're right. Because the debts are premarital and there are no joint financial ties, they might be able to file individually without dragging their spouse into it. Which makes sense, right? You shouldn't be responsible for debt you didn't agree to take on.
Right, but there's always a catch, isn't there?
You know it. Remember that household rule we talked about, where the court looks at the combined household income? Well, it could still come into play here, depending on where they live.
Ugh. So even though they've kept everything separate, they might still be subject to that combined income rule.
Unfortunately, yeah. It really highlights how important it is to get specific legal advice based on your individual situation and where you live.
It does. And it shows how those separate finances and the fact that the debt is premarital can make a big difference. Remember in that first example, everything was so intertwined, so filing individually wasn't really an option.
Exactly. Each case has its own nuances.
Speaking of nuances, what about couples who live in those community property states? That adds another layer of complexity, right?
It definitely does. The chapter brings up Wisconsin as an example. In these states, any debt you rack up during the marriage is usually considered shared, even if only one person's name is on the account.
Wow, so it's like everything's automatically joint debt no matter what.
Pretty much. So if you're thinking about filing individually in a community property state, you need to be aware that your spouse's income and assets could still be affected. Creditors might come after them too.
So even if you're trying to keep things separate, the court might still see it as a shared responsibility when it comes to debt.
Exactly. And that's where the expertise of a lawyer really comes in. They can help you navigate those complexities and protect what can be protected.
Okay, so let's say you're in a community property state and decide to file individually. Does that mean your spouse is just totally out of luck?
Not necessarily. You can still protect your spouse's separate property from creditors as long as they don't also file for bankruptcy.
Okay, so there's a way to shield some assets, but you have to be strategic about it.
Right. And it's important to understand how things work in your specific state. There are also states, like Illinois and Indiana, where property is held as tenants by the entirety, which can also impact how assets are protected during bankruptcy. It can get pretty complicated.
It sounds like there's a lot to keep track of.
Yeah.
So, to sum it up, living in a community property state means that even if you try to file individually, those lines between yours and mine might get blurred when it comes to debt.
Exactly. The court might see it all as ours, even if you don't.
Okay, but there's some good news, right? The chapter mentions that if you have debt from before you were married, usually your spouse isn't responsible for it. That seems fair.
Right. It would be pretty unfair to hold your spouse accountable for debts they had nothing to do with. So if you're the one with premarital debt, you might be able to file for bankruptcy on your own without involving them.
But of course, there's a but.
Always. The key here is that there can't be any joint debt mixed in. Like if you've co-signed a loan or opened a joint credit card since getting married, that could complicate things.
So you can potentially file individually for premarital debt as long as there's no shared debt tangled up in it.
Gotcha. But what about those debts that just don't go away no matter what you do? Like alimony or child support?
Those are what we call non-dischargeable debts, and those are a whole other ballgame. They stick with you even after bankruptcy. It's important to understand how those work, especially if you're considering filing.
Can you give us a quick rundown of how those non-dischargeable debts are treated differently in Chapter 7 versus Chapter 13? You got it. So in Chapter 7, which is often called liquidation bankruptcy, you're basically starting with a clean slate. Most of your unsecured debts, like credit card debt and medical bills, are discharged.
Okay, so you're essentially wiping the slate clean. But what about those non-dischargeable debts? Do they just disappear too?
I wish. Unfortunately, no. Those stick around even after Chapter 7.
So you might get rid of that credit card debt, but you're still on the hook for those ongoing support obligations. What happens in Chapter 13?
Chapter 13 is more about reorganizing your debt. You create a repayment plan over a few years. But here's the thing about those non-dischargeable debts, they get priority in the repayment plan. You have to pay them in full, and sometimes you might even have to catch up on any missed payments before you can even start paying off your other debts.
So it's a way to make sure that you're taking care of those really important obligations first?
Exactly. It recognizes that some debts, especially those related to family support, carry more weight. It's not just about getting yourself out of debt, it's about meeting your responsibilities.
That makes a lot of sense. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the non-filing spouse. What happens to their debts when only one person files for bankruptcy?
That's another important point. Filing for bankruptcy doesn't automatically clear the other spouse of their own debts. They're still responsible for any debt in their name.
Even if they're not the one filing.
Right.
So what could happen to the non-filing spouse?
Well, they could end up stuck with all the remaining debt from the marriage unless they also file. And creditors could still go after them for those debts, especially if there are any joint accounts or property involved.
Oh, wow. So even if you try to keep things separate, filing for bankruptcy can still have a big impact on your spouse.
It really can. Which is why it's so important to communicate openly and honestly throughout the entire process. You need to be on the same page and understand the implications for both of you. And you need to understand how joint accounts or cosign debts can affect things, even if you try to file separately.
It's like a tangled web. You really need to untangle it all and see how everything is connected.
Exactly. And that's where an experienced bankruptcy attorney can be invaluable.
They can help you figure out what your options are and make sure you're both protected.
Absolutely. And they can help you anticipate any potential pitfalls and develop strategies to avoid them.
Now, let's talk about those situations where one spouse is trying to avoid paying their share of the debt and pushes for bankruptcy as a way out. Is that even allowed?
Unfortunately, it happens more often than you'd think. And the answer is yes, it's possible for one spouse to file and essentially avoid taking responsibility for their partner's debt.
Wow, that seems a little unfair. But is it always that easy?
Not always. It's a sensitive situation and needs careful legal guidance to ensure everything is done fairly and legally.
So you can't just use bankruptcy as a loophole to get out of paying what you owe.
Exactly. And the chapter specifically warns against what they call bust-out schemes.
The bust-out schemes. What in the world are those?
Imagine a couple who goes on a spending spree, racking up a ton of debt with the plan to just erase it all through bankruptcy. It's like intentionally getting into debt with no intention of ever paying it back.
Oh, wow. That's pretty sneaky. And risky, I bet.
Oh, it's incredibly risky. And if the court even suspects that there was any fraudulent intent behind that spending, they can object, and the whole bankruptcy could be denied. Not to mention, it's completely illegal.
So it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. There are consequences.
Big time. And it's just not ethical. Bankruptcy is meant to help people get a fresh start, not to be used as a tool to cheat the system.
Right. It's a serious legal process with long-term consequences, and it should be approached with honesty and integrity. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up part one of our discussion about bankruptcy for married couples.
Yeah, I agree. We covered a lot of ground. And I think it's safe to say that it's a lot more complicated than most people realize.
It definitely is.
Yeah.
And it really emphasizes the importance of seeking professional advice. Every situation is unique, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to talk to an experienced bankruptcy attorney who can help you navigate the complexities of the law and make the best decisions for your specific circumstances.
And of course, this is just for informational purposes. It's not legal advice, and it's crucial to consult with a qualified attorney for guidance on your own individual situation.
Always a good reminder. Welcome back. We're continuing our look at bankruptcy considerations for married couples. Remember those real-life examples from Peter Francis Geraci's book, the one with the high-income household and the other with the newlyweds?
Oh, yeah. They really highlighted how much things can vary. There's no simple formula.
Definitely. So now let's dive into some of the big things couples should be thinking about when they're trying to decide whether to file jointly or separately. What do you think is important here?
Well, I'm sure we'll get into the specifics, but I think just having open communication with your spouse is huge.
Absolutely. Geraci really stresses that in the book, that transparency from the get-go is key. You know, making sure you're both on the same page and really understanding your options, and finding a good bankruptcy attorney you can both trust.
Right, someone who can guide you through the process and help you make the best decisions for your situation. Because I think a lot of people try to avoid that, right? They think, oh, I can just figure this out on my own.
Yeah, I've seen that happen, but it's so important to get that professional advice early on, especially because bankruptcy law can be really complicated. There are so many nuances.
Okay, so let's say a couple decides, all right, we need to explore bankruptcy. Let's talk to an attorney. What are some of the first things they should be talking about in that initial consultation?
One of the big ones is whether filing jointly or separately makes more sense. Sometimes filing jointly can actually save you money on fees, but there are also times when filing separately might be the smarter move.
Like in those examples we talked about before, right? The newlyweds and the high-income household, filing separately seemed like it could be a better option. But of course, like with everything else, it's not always that cut and dry.
Right. Remember that household rule. It can get tricky.
And community property laws, don't forget about those. They can really throw a wrench in things.
Exactly. Which is why that initial consultation is so crucial. You need to understand the potential consequences of each option.
So if you're thinking about filing jointly, Both spouses need to be at that consultation, right? It's a joint decision.
Oh, absolutely. Geraci makes that very clear. He says it's so important for both spouses to hear the same information at the same time. After all, it's a decision that will affect both of their financial futures.
Makes sense. What about couples who decide to file separately? Does the non-filing spouse still need to be involved in the process at all?
I think it's a good idea, even if they're not the one technically filing. They should at least understand how things work and how the process might affect them.
That's a good point, because we talked about how even if you file individually, your spouse's income and assets might still be considered, especially in those community property states.
Right, exactly. And even in states that don't have community property laws, things like joint accounts or shared debts can still impact the non-filing spouse.
Hmm.
So it's really about understanding how your finances are connected, legally speaking.
It's like you have to untangle that web of finances and see how everything's linked.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's where a good attorney can really help you, right? To kind of make sense of it all.
Absolutely. They can help you figure out the best course of action and avoid any potential pitfalls. Now, shifting gears a bit, I think it's worth talking a bit more about those non-dischargeable debts, things like alimony, child support, and sometimes even student loans. Those are the debts that you can't just get rid of through bankruptcy.
Yeah, those are the ones that kind of hang over your head no matter what.
That's a good way to put it. So, can you remind us again how those debts are treated differently in Chapter 7 versus Chapter 13? I think a lot of people get confused about that.
Oh, yeah. It can definitely be confusing. So with Chapter 7, which is often called liquidation bankruptcy, it's like you're wiping the slate clean. Most of those unsecured debts, things like credit card bills, medical bills, those are usually discharged.
Okay, so you get a fresh start. But what about those non-dischargeable debts like alimony or child support? Do those just magically disappear too?
Sadly, no. Those stick around even with Chapter 7. You're still responsible for those.
Okay, so you might get a break from your credit cards, but those support obligations are still there. What about Chapter 13? How does that work with non-dischargeable debts?
Chapter 13 is a little different. It's more about setting up a repayment plan. So you're not necessarily getting rid of the debt altogether, but you're coming up with a plan to manage it over time. Usually it's 3 to 5 years.
Okay, so you're not starting with a blank slate like you might with Chapter 7. What happens to those non-dischargeable debts under the repayment plan? Do you still have to pay them back?
You do. Those actually get top priority in the repayment plan. You have to pay those debts in full, and you might even have to catch up on any missed payments before you even start tackling your other debts.
Oh, wow. So it's really structured to make sure you're fulfilling those important obligations. It's not just about getting yourself out of debt, it's about taking care of your responsibilities.
Exactly. We've been talking a lot about the legal and financial side of bankruptcy, but it's important to remember that there's a huge emotional component to this, too. It's a stressful experience for anyone, and even more so for couples.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of times people feel shame or embarrassment about even considering bankruptcy. It can be really hard to talk about, even with your spouse.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But I think it's important to remember that it's not a sign of weakness. It's a legal tool, and sometimes it's the best option to get back on track financially.
I agree. It's like hitting the reset button, but it takes a lot of courage to take that step and ask for help. What do you think is the biggest misconception about getting legal help with bankruptcy?
Well, I think a lot of people assume it's too expensive, or that it's only for people who are already in deep financial trouble.
I've heard that too. But a lot of law firms, like Jersey Law, offer free consultations. So you can sit down with an attorney, ask questions, get advice, and you're not obligated to hire them.
Oh, that's really great. It takes a lot of the pressure off, and it gives people a chance to explore their options.
Exactly. And it goes back to Jersey Law's whole mission, which is to make bankruptcy more accessible and understandable. Plus, they've got those amazing educational resources like their free non-bankruptcy credit counseling course online.
So they're really focused on empowering people with information. So as we're wrapping up this part of our conversation, what would you say is the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think the biggest thing is to realize that bankruptcy isn't the end of the world. It can actually be an opportunity for a fresh start.
I like that, a fresh start. And it's something you can face together as a team.
Definitely. But it takes careful planning and open communication. And remember, you don't have to go through it alone. There are resources available to help, including legal professionals like Geraci Law.
Right, exactly. There is no shame in seeking guidance from those who know the ropes. In fact, reaching out for help might be the smartest decision you make. Welcome back. We're wrapping up our deep dive into bankruptcy considerations for married couples, and we've been focusing on Peter Francis Geraci's insights from the complete book on bankruptcy. We've learned so much already, but I know there's always more to consider when it comes to this topic.
You're absolutely right. It's a big decision with a lot of moving parts, and it's important to think about those potential pitfalls and what you can do to set yourself up for success, both during and after bankruptcy.
Okay, so let's dive right in. What are some common mistakes that couples should try to avoid when they're going through this process?
Well, Geraci really stresses the importance of being honest throughout the entire process. You can't try to hide assets or income. That's a big no-no.
Yeah, that makes sense. You're talking about bankruptcy fraud, right?
Yeah.
And the consequences can be pretty serious.
Very serious. Not only could it derail your entire bankruptcy case, but it could also land you in legal trouble. It's just not worth it.
So be upfront with your attorney and the court. That way, you can work together to find a legitimate solution that addresses your financial challenges.
Exactly. Honesty is the best policy, especially in this situation. Another thing to keep in mind is how bankruptcy might affect your spouse's credit, even if they're not the one filing.
Oh, right, because those joint accounts and debts are still going to be on both of your credit reports.
Exactly. So even if only one spouse is filing, it's crucial to think ahead and have a plan for how you're going to rebuild your credit together as a couple.
So you're not just thinking about getting through the bankruptcy process, you're also thinking about what comes after. Okay, so what are some steps couples can take to minimize the damage to their credit and start rebuilding after bankruptcy?
One thing Geraci mentions is being really cautious about taking on new debt after bankruptcy. It's easy to feel like you have a clean slate and want to jump back into things, but it's important to take it slow.
Yeah, you don't want to fall back into those same habits that got you into trouble in the first place. It's like when you clean out your closet and it feels amazing, but then you start shopping again, and before you know it, it's cluttered again.
That's a perfect analogy. It's really about changing your mindset and developing healthy financial habits. So let's talk about those healthy habits. What are some things couples can start doing to get their finances back on track?
Well, I think creating a realistic budget is a good starting point.
Absolutely. That's one of the foundations of good financial management. Track your income, your spending, and make conscious choices about where your money is going.
It's all about being mindful and making sure your spending aligns with your goals.
Exactly. Another important step is to start rebuilding your credit. That might mean getting a secured credit card or maybe becoming an authorized user on a family member's account if they have good credit habits, of course.
So it's about taking those small steps to show that you're responsible with credit.
Right. And over time, those small steps can really add up. Make sure you're paying your bills on time and keeping your credit utilization low. Don't max out those credit cards.
Yeah, those are really important factors when it comes to your credit score. What about saving? That's the big part of the equation too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Even if you can only put aside a small amount each month, it's important to make it a habit. Those savings will provide a buffer for unexpected expenses and help you achieve your financial goals.
It's like having a safety net. It gives you that peace of mind knowing that you're prepared just in case. You know, we've talked about so much in this series, but if you had to choose one key takeaway for our listeners, what would it be?
I think the most important thing is to remember that bankruptcy isn't the end of the road. It can be a new beginning.
I love that. It's a chance to hit the reset button, learn from your mistakes, and build a stronger financial future together.
Exactly. And you don't have to navigate this alone. There are resources available to help you every step of the way, including credit counseling agencies, financial advisors, and legal professionals like the folks at Geraci Law.
Right. And remember, Geraci Law offers free consultations, so you can talk to an expert and get some personalized advice. You're not obligated to hire them or anything. Plus, they have those great educational resources, like that free non-bankruptcy credit counseling course on infotapes.com.
It's all about empowering people with information and options.
Well said. So, as we wrap up our conversation about bankruptcy for married couples, I want to leave you with this. With the right support and a little planning, you can get through this. It might be a tough chapter, but it doesn't have to define your story.
It's about working together to build that brighter financial future.
Absolutely. And as always, this is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. If you need guidance on your specific situation, please consult with a qualified attorney.
Great advice. It's been great talking about all this with you.
Same here. Thanks for joining us.